yourself, John?
Yeah, look, I'm John Maynard, a Warramai man from Port Stephens region, which is just across the river in Newcastle, across the Hunter River, or Kokon, which is the Awabakal name for the river. And I've been in academia for the past 30 years, which is I left school at the age of 15, halfway through year 9, and I grew up in the school system of the 1950s and 1960s where we as Aboriginal people weren't in the history or the textbooks. So I had not a fun time in school. I mean, I switched off from the time I got there. There was nothing to inspire me or encourage me or support me as an Aboriginal kid coming through the school system of those days. So as I said, I left in 1969, spent the next 25 years in a whole variety of jobs, none even remotely related to academia or education or history. And it was not till I was just nearly 40 and I'd landed back at home with my parents. I'd come out of a marriage separation. I was unemployed. And my parents were somewhat surprised to see my return at that particular point in time. And not to say they were ready to shut the door in my face, but, you know, somewhat surprised. And my father, basically, to give me a kick up the bum, wanted me to do something. And I had, in a sense, always had a real deep interest in reading, consumed a lot of books from a very young age. Some sense, I think I educated myself. I switched off school, but I was reading a lot of material. I also loved to write. I was always writing stories from a little kid. So my father, with that background knowledge, encouraged me to undertake a family history project, which was putting together the story of my grandfather and the rise of early Aboriginal political activism, which began here in New South Wales in 1924 in Sydney with the formation of the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, the AAPA. And as I said, the first united all Aboriginal political group to form in this country. And their platform back then was first to demand, if you like, a national land rights agenda, because they demanded enough land for each and every Aboriginal family in the country. They also put up self-determination 50 years before the Whitlam government. And also we've just had the referendum for the voice. In 1927 they had a widely published manifesto which went to the Commonwealth government, state government and published widely, in which they demanded the abolishment of all the government state-controlled protection boards to be replaced by an all-Aboriginal board to sit under the Commonwealth government. That is a voice to Parliament 100 years ago. So that is the reality of where that comes from. It's not a recent phenomenon, you know, that people are talking about. This began in 2017 with the Uluru Statement. It is not. The reality is our people have made that demand for 100 years. So that's something, as far as history, needs to record and acknowledge. So that's my background, I guess. And I said I've had a rich journey in the sense I finished up, was putting this family history together, going to the university. I'd never set foot in a university before. But I went there not to enrol. I knew about archives and libraries and little museums and historical societies. We had photographs. We had some of my grandfather's letters to government, and we had some newspaper cuttings, but I intended to expand on that and actually see what was there. So going to Wallatuka, the Aboriginal Education Centre at the University of Newcastle in late '93, I thought I might be able to get some more information on other areas that I hadn't actually thought of exploring. I went over there. Tracy Bunder, a Murray Aboriginal woman, was the director of Wallatuka in those days. We had a very brief conversation. By the time I turned around, I'd been enrolled. Tracy had kidnapped me into a diploma course, and I owe her a deep sense of gratitude for that. I did the diploma in 2 years. I did a BA with the University of South Australia in 2 years, and I did a PhD in 3 years. So that's been the journey, and here I am today sitting up, retired, but busier than I was before, as an Emeritus Professor with 15 books published. So that's my journey. Yeah. As I said earlier, you know, I didn't get a lot of inspiration or support or encouragement coming through the school system. I drew my inspiration particularly from my father. You know, my father was an inspiring individual and gave me great support and encouragement, and certainly in the sense, despite my failing through school and switching off school, I mean, my father and my mother, non-Indigenous is my mother's background, they gave me a great outlook on the world. There's nothing you can't achieve if you put your mind to it and you apply yourself to it. And my father, of course, was a top Aboriginal jockey. You know, he was as a jockey, he's not a big man, but to me, my father was a big man, you know, and he just had that presence about him. And he was a great jockey, a great country jockey, but as a young man, he rode in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne. He rode in 3 Caulfield Cups. He rode in the Melbourne Cup. He rode winners in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore and Malaysia. Over 1,500 winners in his career, which went from 1948 to 1994. He was still riding at the age of 64. And he was also introduced to the Queen. She came out here in 1992 and Prince Philip on a visit, and my parents received a phone call from the Premier's office that the Queen had requested to meet him because she was going to Randwick to open up a new grandstand there in 1992, and it coincided with the running of the Queen's Cup. The Queen's Cup had been run since 1952 all the way through to 1992, and the winner of the first Queen's Cup was my father as an 18-year-old apprentice. And he would have met the Queen because they were on their way to Australia in 1952, had just been married. They were in South Africa on their honeymoon and received news that the King had died, and instead of continuing on to Australia, one of their jobs to present the trophy of the Queen's Cup, they turned around and went back to England, and of course the Queen was in coronation and took up the mantle as the Queen of the Commonwealth. So my father always said that except for the King dying, he would have met the Queen. So they must have had long memories, because the reality is that she had made this request, and he went down to Randwick and spent about 45 minutes with the Queen and Prince Philip, because they were mad race goers, and actually asked my father which horse he would like to ride. They were going around the enclosure, and he said that one, and of course it won. So I don't know if they backed it or not. But yes, he was an inspiring individual. But he also carried the stories of my grandfather. My grandfather died 8 years before I was born, so I never had the opportunity of meeting, this remarkable Aboriginal patriot and activist and individual. But there was my father's memories, my uncle's, my auntie's memories, so of him as an individual, and also the material that the family had maintained with photographs and letters, and also some newspaper cuttings. And of course, my research, which has gone over 30 years, which was a PhD, a book, and probably dozens and dozens and dozens of articles, has revealed the depth of his activism. Not just him, others like Sid Ridgway, Dick Johnson, Tom Lacey, Jimmy Doyle, Johnny Donovan. These were Jane Duren. These were the Aboriginal activists of the 1920s. This is 14 years before the Day of Mourning in 1938. And it was significant. They held 4 annual conferences in Sydney, Kempsey, Grafton and Lismore. They had a membership that grew to over 600. They had 14 branches with 4 sub-branches. They even opened their own offices in Crown Street, Sydney, with the phone connected, which was in the board records. And the Protection Board did everything possible to stamp out this flickering flame of hope that was put up by these early Aboriginal activists. And the challenge they put to the board by exposing them and embarrassing them in the press, particularly over the removal of Aboriginal children, which had begun to escalate, and also the tearing away of Aboriginal independent farms. What a lot of people aren't aware of is the fact that between 1860, and I'm talking New South Wales here, but it's also in Queensland and Victoria and South Australia, Aboriginal people in the mid-19th century had began to regain land, independent farms. They were writing to state governments and either self-educated themselves, or they had assistance from white supporters. So in this period, Aboriginal people regained something like New South Wales, 27,000 acres of land. Now, in the first instance, the Protection Board would write a letter, because there was no manager or out on the mission or reserve. It was under the police control. They'd write a letter to the local policeman where this letter had come from, said, look, go out and have a look at this land these Aboriginal people are asking for. Now, these letters are in the archives, a lot of these letters in regards to this land. So police officers go out, come back, wrote a letter back to the state government, the Protection Board, said it's heavily timbered, worthless scrub, give it to them. So the land was handed over to Aboriginal people. Within 12 to 18 months, the same police officer was writing back to inform them the land's been cleared, they've fenced it, they've got crops, they've got livestock, they've built homesteads. Aboriginal people prospered on this land for 40 and 50 years. In the records, they're clearing 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 pounds. That is a lot of money at the turn of the century of success. They're winning the blue ribbons in the local regional shows. They know the seasons better than anyone else. The land they're asking for is on their traditional land. No one knows that better than themselves. That's why they were prospering on this land. So these are the two catalysts that saw the rise of organised Aboriginal political activism, the tearing away of that land, and then the tearing away of Aboriginal kids to be institutionalised. That was the catalyst for the rise of organised Aboriginal political activism. Heather Goodall has called that tearing away of land as the second dispossession. So it was dramatic, horrific. In many instances, the records state the police went in with guns and Aboriginal people were thrown off. No compensation for 4 and 5 decades on these farms, with nothing more than the shirts on their back. The ramifications of that are where we are today, still in a hole trying to crawl back out, because as I said, the horrific impact of that we have not recovered from. But as I said, that was the catalyst for the rise of Aboriginal political revolt and my grandfather's impact in that space. Yeah. Well, certainly, the first major research study for me was, set off by my father wanting me to undertake a family history. Well, I carried that on through all of my university studies, and it culminated in the PhD and then the book Fight for Liberty and Freedom, which was published in 2007, which told the story of the AAPA and my grandfather and all of those other early Aboriginal political activists. It impacted on many people. Gary Foley's great-grandfather, Jimmy Doyle, was an office bearer of the AAPA. That's why Gary and I have such a strong connection. Gary Williams, who was at university with Charlie Perkins in 1964, his grandmother's brother, Lambert Waddy, was an office bearer of the organisation. So there's many significant Aboriginal activists of the 60s, 70s and 80s whose forebears were actually with the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association back in the 1920s. But continuing on from there, I've explored so many different areas. I mean, I just wasn't doing Aboriginal political activism and focusing on that. For a time there, I was working with the health faculty at the University of Newcastle on a major national health project, Healing Our Way, which saw me work in many of our communities, urban, rural and remote, looking to educate non-Indigenous doctors, nurses, medical students, going out into work in an Aboriginal community for the first time, having no knowledge of what it was like and how to operate, and no knowledge of Aboriginal people or culture. The project was all about interviewing people in our communities and having their voice to inform. It's going to be a CD-ROM, an interactive CD-ROM, which was quite revolutionary and out there at that particular point in time in the 90s. And it was a 2-year project, and it was a wonderful experience, as I said, to work in so many places, inspiring people. That CD-ROM, Healing Our Way, finished up, I'd probably say it was being used in every health faculty in the country at one point, as far as educating their medical students coming through and nurses. and it made a major impact. I've also did the history of Aboriginal jockeys because my father was a top jockey, and I grew up on the racecourse here at Newcastle, and I knew that there was Stan Johnson, Normie Rose, Gordon Taylor, Davey Matthews, my father, Merv Maynard. There was a whole host of Aboriginal jockeys riding here. But if you picked up any racing histories of Australia, there was no mention of Aboriginal jockeys. So I thought, here is a story that needs to be told. And it also involved the horse as far as Aboriginal people were concerned, which was a weapon in the first instance by settlers. They could cover great distances with speed. The horse was a terrifying animal with people riding in with guns and cutlasses. But then, of course, Aboriginal people, they wanted to learn how to ride horses, and the impact they then later made in the stock industry, which, they say that Australia was carried on the sheep's back. I'd say it's carried on the black's back, who was riding, in the stock industry, sheep and cattle, and carried that industry. So many great Aboriginal horsemen and women. And racing was no different. We had, top jockeys all the way across the decades, and many, I remember Darby McCarthy was another one that he come from Cunnamulla, and I interviewed Darb, and he said, where I come from in Cunnamulla, it wasn't the top end of town. On one side we had the sewerage outlet, and the other side was the garbage dump, and we were in tin lean-tos. But racing took me from there, and horse racing took Darby McCarthy. He was riding in France for a French trainer. He was living in a 2-storey French mansion with a French maid, and went to the races in England to the Derby with top hat and tails. That is an incredible journey. I actually had a picture of Darby McCarthy on my wall in 1967 or 1968, getting out of a chauffeur-driven Rolls Royce in his top hat and tails. But his was a remarkable journey. So, and these are the stories that I've always been driven to tell, because our history is like a giant jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing, and we need to put those pieces back into the puzzle. For inspiration, and I've said before that I was deprived that inspiration as history and textbooks because we weren't in it, except as a dying race or belonging to the Stone Age. So we needed inspiration for our young people. The stories that I tell are the missing histories, and they're there for our people and our communities, and particularly the younger generation, to know that they've got heroes and heroines in their past, and that's where they draw their inspiration and pride from. That's been the main driver for me as far as history is concerned, in putting us back on the page, the history page. Yeah, look, history is critically important for us, and and I'll re-emphasise that importance. That we were deprived history, we were cut off from history. As I said before, we were told we belonged to the Stone Age and we're a dying race. The reality is we needed to challenge that, and we need to put ourselves back in. It's not just about discoverers and explorers and settlers and Don Bradman and even Farlap. Aboriginal people have played a major part in the history of this country and needed to be brought into that space. So these are the stories that I like to see delivered to our communities, our families and our younger generations. But it's not just us, it's non-Indigenous people. They need to be told the truth of what happened in this country across the last 230 odd years, to know the truth about this country and how that history has impacted onto us. But even of greater importance is the fact that this is 65,000 years of history. That is the country's greatest treasure, greatest cultural treasure. That is there to be shared by everybody. And the reality is that's the thing that tourists from overseas want to come and hear about and see. That's what needs to be capitalised on, and that's what needs to be told. And as I said, non-Indigenous people that are largely ignorant of history, they need to be informed of what's happened. Not just the tragedy of and horror of what's happened, but also the incredible triumphs, that Aboriginal people have been part of. So that's really important part of history. Yeah, we take it for granted today, with rugby league and AFL, your Buddy Franklins and, your Jonathan Thurstons, your Greg Inglis's, your Michael Longs. I mean, you've had a whole generations now, four or five decades of Aboriginal success on rugby league and AFL grounds, which have, garnered incredible support. Prior to that, it is important to realise there were barriers of calibre. You could count on two hands the number of Aboriginal players that had actually got a go prior to that. We had many great players that didn't get the opportunity because of the calibre that stopped them from actually getting the opportunity to take part in these sports. It wasn't just rugby league and AFL, athletics, cricket. We had a bowler, that Eddie Gilbert, who bowled Don Bradman for a duck and was barred from cricket. They said he was a chucker. The reality was he was so fast they had to get him out. Probably the major sport that Aboriginal people were given a go in was boxing. And of course you can get killed in the boxing ring. But something like 15% of Australian boxing champions have been Aboriginal fighters. And that's from a 3% population. So it marks that incredible gift. And we had Lionel Rose. I mean, I followed Lionel during the 60s and had a big scrapbook and used to listen to his fights on the radio and later on television. And he was an inspiring figure. Yvonne Goolagong Cawley. And Ash Barty, of course, has repeated that just recently. And of course, probably the most significant moment was Kathy Freeman at the 2000 Olympic Games. One, lighting the torch at the top of the stadium there, but then, of course, winning the gold medal, which I don't think there'd be many people in the country who weren't there watching that race that night. The country held its breath and bang, Kathy delivered. So, these are the big sporting moments. But in understanding that, people have got to understand that there were barriers to Aboriginal people for a long period of time taking part. And some of those barriers are still there. You scratch the surface and racism will rear its ugly head. Look what happened to Adam Goodes, and which has recently happened as well in rugby league with Latrell Mitchell. And I mean, there's a whole history of this where people with racist, bigotry and ignorance set out to denigrate and attack, Aboriginal sports men and women. So there's a history of it. I've done a lot of work in the US, primarily from my Aboriginal political activism research, that I was able to reveal that my grandfather's organisation had international connections with African Americans, and Marcus Garvey, the leader of the biggest black nationalist movement ever assembled in the United States, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and many others drew strength from that particular organisation. So my grandfather, as a dock worker and other Aboriginal activists, were coming into contact with visiting merchant sailors, black sailors, and after 1904, with the beginning of the White Australia policy, there's no red carpet being rolled out to international black sailors coming off ships. They were made to feel very uncomfortable. But they spotted black workers on the docks and they'd congregate with them. So through that, my grandfather gained information on manifestos and newspapers, and he realised then that the racism, the prejudice, the oppression that we're facing here is not localised, it's a global thing. And that's where we need to, fight it in that sense. So they had connections with these large, black movements overseas. Of course, I also did a study on Native American comparisons, and there's no greater mirror image of experience for Indigenous peoples than the Native American and the Aboriginal experience. Invasion, occupation, dispossession, cultural destruction, disease, being congregated onto reserves and closed off from the rest of society, kids being taken away and put into institutions. So there's all of these similar experience that were bubbling away historically, which, you know, my research was able to bring to the fore and look at those comparatives. And having the good fortune to visit Native American centres in universities, but also visit Native American communities on the ground, you know, and hear stories on the ground of those times and experiences, and the similarities was, you know, revealing. Yeah. Well, Aboriginal servicemen and women was another history that the country was largely unaware of. My work on the rise of early Aboriginal political activism in the 1920s was revealing in the sense that a number of those early Aboriginal activists were returned soldiers from the First World War. And what many people didn't realise, they went and fought for their country and were under the impression that what they were fighting for was that their own people would get greater recognition and support through their, you know, their efforts fighting for Australia. When they returned, they were shocked to the impact that they weren't treated the same as non-Indigenous soldiers. Government brought in the Soldier Resettlement Scheme, which made available farming land for returned servicemen. Many Aboriginal people were told, servicemen were told, doesn't apply to you, you're Aboriginal, and were turned away. I finished up, Mick Dodson and I were part of a large 6-year project serving our country. There were 6 or 7 researchers. That involved the Department of Defence, the Veterans Affairs, the War Memorial, Australian National University, University of Newcastle, Catholic University, I think Melbourne University. And we went around the country and did lots of interviews with forebears who'd fought, and their families had stories to tell, you know, of that. And also going back in the records, Aboriginal men and women have fought in every campaign and war this country's fought in, from the Boer War, First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, right through to Afghanistan and Iraq. Back in the 1980s with the bicentenary, there was a thing that revealed that 280 Aboriginal men had fought in World War I. Work that we'd done has taken that up to over 1,000 Aboriginal men fought in World War I. That was at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. Many died. The charge of in Bathsheba in Palestine, interesting enough, the light horse. Aboriginal men were in that ride, and quite a number have died. And as I said, Aboriginal people died at Gallipoli. Aboriginal people died at the Western Front. And it's important that the country recognises that. Over 3,000 Aboriginal men fought in the Second World War. And again, you know, but it was the same thing. Returning home, they were not treated the same as non-Indigenous returning soldiers. So it's important that the country recognises this history. Again, another missing aspect of history, and that Aboriginal people deserve their recognition. Aboriginal families and communities carry great pride in their servicemen and women who fought for the country, you know, and that's a part of our history. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, there's Western world and science. It's time, you know, or history is linear. It just runs. This happened, that happened. You know. Our history is circular. Our history is circular in that sense. And when you realise, and people have now realised that scientifically Aboriginal people have been here for 65,000 years. In just my lifetime, I'm 70 next year, and growing up, back in the 50s, Aboriginal people were thought to be here for 10,000 years. Then it was 20,000 years. Then it was 30,000 years. Then it was 40,000, 50,000. Now it's 65,000 years. It continues to go up. So that incredible amount of time, you know, we had words for history. Here, Awabakal country, the missionary Threlkeld recorded as Yuriki, which is long ago, since, past history. You know, that, and we had our storytellers and our historians, if you like, who told these stories and reinforced what had happened to people. We have stories of the rising sea levels, ice ages, volcanoes, earthquakes, major fires. These are stories that are embedded in Aboriginal knowledge and memory and time. So it's a different way of looking at time and the past, certainly, through Aboriginal eyes. I think I really like a quote, an old elder in Central Australia. It was when they'd marked, the Aboriginal Australians had been here for 50,000 years. And I think it was a journal that said to this old fellow, he said, what do you think? You've been here for 50,000 years. And he looked at the guy quizzically, he said, 50,000 years, we've been here much longer. We've been here in the time before time began. We have come directly out of the dream time of the creative ancestors, and we have lived and kept the earth as it was on the very first day. And that's the importance of Aboriginal culture, looking after the environment and ensuring that each next generation is handed, a world still in a pristine state and not exploited, which is where we are today. And I think that brings the point that we're at a cataclysmic moment in history, and you have to look with global warming and rising sea levels and catastrophic storms and fires and floods. I mean, best go back to Indigenous knowledge of what needs to be done. Talking about the Wallatuka Institute and the Amilliko Research Centre at the University of Newcastle, I wouldn't be sitting in this seat today except for those centres. I mean, I went to Wallatuka not to enrol as a mature age student, 39 years of age, and my journey through today is because of the incredible support and encouragement I got from Wallatuka as a 39, 40-year-old student. It was nothing like my school years where I got no support or no encouragement. All the lecturers, all the support staff were Aboriginal. There was an incredible sense of camaraderie and belonging to a family in that space, and you were given that support. As students, we studied hard, we partied hard, but it was an incredible space to be in. There's incredible pride in people's memories who've been through these places. And as I said, the incredible support received. Amilliko, the Indigenous, well, I should go on. Wallatuka was established in 1983, and it's 40 years this year since it was formed. And that was a lot of Aboriginal community input. And their success, there's 1,700 Indigenous students there today. Back in 1993, I think we had 25 in my class, but half of those were Indigenous. So that's the incredible growth and success of these places. Amilliko came into being in 1997. There was 6 universities were rewarded or awarded Commonwealth funding to set up Indigenous research centres, and Amilliko, which was set up at the University of Newcastle, was the only one on the east coast of Australia. Each of those centres got $2.5 million to set up. As far as I'm aware, Amilliko is the only one still in existence today. And it's just there, I guess, but it is still there. But the incredible success we had at that particular point in time, there was myself, John Lester was the director, and Nerita Blair. And I don't know whether you call us the Three Musketeers or the Three Stooges, but anyway, we were the team that kicked that off. And within 2 years, we'd had a 75% strike rate with ARC grants, incredible success with attracting funding and research outcomes across a whole vast spectrum of areas, most largely driven by community. And it was a very, very successful time period. And, I look back to those days with great delight. Oh, look, I get to talk to schools and certainly to young Indigenous students just starting, set your sights high. There's nothing you can't accomplish today. And as I said, we've got people in universities. When I left school in 1969, there was no Wallatuka. There was no land councils, there were no Aboriginal medical services, there were no children's services, there were no legal services, and there was certainly no thought in my mind that you could go to university. That just wasn't on the agenda. That shows the incredible progress we've made, largely driven by Aboriginal people across the higher education sector and through the school systems. Still got a long way to go, I might add. But that's the incredible success we've had. I would say to them, as I said, aim your sights high. There's nothing you cannot achieve as long as you apply yourself. In the future, if you want to fly a rocket ship to Mars, you can do it if you apply yourself. And I think it's also important to carry that belief of what you're achieving has impact into our communities and is there to inspire future generations. So the people coming through, they pick up the torch and carry it on and bring more and more through the gate. And we've got lawyers, we've got doctors, we even had a pilot, come through at Newcastle. There's so many areas. It's such an exciting time period to be a part of. So, and as I said, set your sights high. Nothing you can't do. Yeah, a great disappointment on what could have been achieved, I think, will be the reflection on 2023. And it's just a tragedy. I think the government should have went early with this because they had 75% support very early. I think they relaxed and took it too easy and just thought it was a done thing. And giving them, the opposition, time to mobilise and the right-wing extremism, and when you've got social media to play its part in convincing, Middle Australia is so easily led, and stampeded in the opposite direction. That's the tragedy of what happened. So there's a lesson in that sense. We've got to educate, wider non-Indigenous Australia. That's where history comes in. The next big thing is truth-telling. We need to move into that space. We need to do that quickly. We need support. We need Indigenous historians to be trained and go out and work. Non-Indigenous historians to go out and work with our people and communities and educate wider, white Australia on the real history of this country. And I said, when people are better informed, then you can point out the misinformation, the ludicrous statements that are made. That's what we've got to do. And as I said, I think the future is always bright, in that sense, and that we do move on to this truth-telling and we look upon that and celebrate the country's richest cultural treasure, which is 65,000 years of Aboriginal connection to this continent. That is there to be shared by all.